Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone. History has a way of remembering wars, revolutions, and empires, but some of its most pressing stories are buried in the shadows, silenced not by accident, but by deliberate decision. The 1980s is remembered as the decade of Wall Street greed, Cold War anxieties, and neon consumer culture. Yet behind the glitter of the Reagan years, a quiet plague swept across the globe, leaving millions in mourning and reshaping medicine, politics, and identity forever. The HIV/AIDS epidemic did not simply arrive as a medical crisis. It was also a crisis of morality, prejudice, and power. And within this dark chapter, there lies a story that still disturbs many, that treatments which might have helped were sidelined, silenced, or buried, not by scientific impossibility, but by the entanglement of politics, profit, and stigma. The early years of the AIDS epidemic were chaotic, defined by fear more than understanding. In 1981, doctors in Los Angeles reported cases of a strange pneumonia, known as PCP, striking young gay men with no previous health problems. Soon, other rare infections, Kaposi's sarcoma, a cancer-like disease, were being documented. The patients shared no clear link other than their sexuality, and in the homophobic environment of the era, the disease was quickly branded the gay plague. It would take until 1983 for French researchers at the Pasteur Institute to isolate the virus that caused it, eventually named human immunodeficiency virus HIV. But in those 2 years of confusion, thousands had already died, and millions were already infected. The panic created the perfect storm for scientific rivalries, political indifference, and pharmaceutical opportunism. In this storm, alternative approaches and potential treatments began surfacing, but many were quickly dismissed or suppressed. At the center of the controversy was not only AZT, the first FDA-approved drug for HIV, but also the many therapies that competed with it. AZT, or azithromycin, was not new. It had been synthesized in the 1960s as a failed cancer drug. By the mid-1980s, it was repurposed for HIV and became the symbol of progress. Yet its story is complex. Clinical trials were rushed, results were contested, and the dosage proved so toxic that it often weakened patients as much as it helped them. Still, AZT was pushed forward aggressively, in part because it offered something tangible at a time of desperation, and in part because it promised pharmaceutical profit. What happened to other treatments tells us just as much. In San Francisco, New York, and across Europe, physicians experimented with combinations of drugs, immune-boosting therapies, and even herbal treatments. Some researchers believe that the immune system could be strengthened rather than merely suppressed, and that long-term management might be possible. Reports circulated of compounds like L721, derived from egg lipids, which seemed to inhibit HIV replication in test tubes and showed early promise in patients. Similarly, a compound called DNCB, used topically, was claimed by some doctors to stimulate immune response in AIDS patients. Even treatments involving low-dose interferon or peptide-based drugs were being investigated. Yet these alternatives often never made it past early trials, not because they were disproven, but because they lacked the backing of major pharmaceutical companies or clashed with a single drug solution being promoted. In many cases, funding was cut, publications were stalled, and researchers who spoke too loudly about alternatives were marginalized. The scientific establishment of the 1980s, influenced by both the desperation of the crisis and the lobbying of pharmaceutical interests, closed ranks around AZT as the standard. The politics of silence played an equally significant role. AIDS was not only a medical issue but a cultural one, tangled up in homophobia, racism, and the politics of morality. The Reagan administration, deeply allied with the religious right, remained largely silent as the epidemic raged. Reagan himself did not publicly utter the word AIDS until 1985, by which time thousands had died. In this climate, any treatment associated with gay communities or grassroots clinics was often dismissed outright as illegitimate. Many of the early experimental therapies came not from prestigious labs but from small collectives, activist doctors, and desperate patients themselves,
who organized buyers' clubs to import unapproved drugs from abroad. These buyers' clubs became lifelines. Films like Dallas Buyers Club later dramatized their work, but the reality was far wider than one man's story. In cities from New York to San Francisco, networks of patients imported compounds like peptide T, ribavirin, or isoprenazine from Mexico and Europe, reporting real improvements. Some claim that these treatments helped them live longer or at least ease their suffering, but because these therapies could not be patented or monetized at scale, they were rarely pursued with the same rigor as AZT. The FDA, under pressure from both activists and pharmaceutical firms, cracked down on unauthorized distribution, leading to raids and legal threats against people whose only crime was trying to survive. One of the most striking cases was that of Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, a South African-born physician in New York. Sonnabend was among the first to treat AIDS patients with a holistic approach, combining antiviral strategies with immune support and even dietary interventions. He argued that HIV alone might not be the full story, and that environmental and co-infections played a role in immune collapse. For this, he was criticized by peers and largely excluded from mainstream research circles. Yet many of his patients outlived their initial prognosis, suggesting his methods had value. The silencing of treatments was not only about science, it was also about narrative control. To admit that grassroots collectives, gay activists, or independent physicians might have useful answers would mean redistributing authority away from the pharmaceutical establishment. It would mean acknowledging that knowledge can come from outside the sanctioned institutions of power. Instead, the narrative crystallized. AZT was the frontline weapon, and anything else was dismissed as unscientific, even if evidence suggested otherwise. The cost was measured in human lives. In the late 1980s, AZT's high price, around $10,000 per year, an astronomical sum at the time, meant that many patients could not afford it. Activists accused Burroughs Wellcome, the drug's manufacturer, of profiteering from a plague. Demonstrations erupted, with ACT UP leading some of the most dramatic protests in U.S. history, storming Wall Street, the FDA, and even churches to demand faster drug approvals, lower prices, and honest research. While these protests succeeded in reshaping the regulatory landscape, they also exposed the darker truth that the silencing of alternative treatments was not only about science but about control over life, death, and profit. By the early 1990s, the failure of AZT as a monotherapy became undeniable. Resistance developed quickly, side effects were brutal, and survival rates barely improved. It was only with the advent of combination antiretroviral therapy in the mid-1990s, using 3 or more drugs together, that a true breakthrough occurred. This cocktail approach transformed AIDS from a death sentence into a chronic condition, allowing millions to live decades longer. Yet it is worth asking, could this discovery have arrived sooner if alternative therapies in the 1980s had not been dismissed so quickly? Could lives have been saved if research had been allowed to flourish in multiple directions rather than funneled into one narrow path? The story of the AIDS treatment silenced in the 1980s is not a conspiracy in the Hollywood sense. It is something more unsettling. It is a story of systemic failure, where stigma, politics, and profit combine to limit the scope of human imagination in a time of crisis. It reveals how medicine is never just science, but also culture, economics, and power. And it reminds us that when society allows prejudice or greed to dictate which treatments are pursued and which are silenced, the cost is paid in human suffering. Today, with HIV treatment more advanced than ever, and with PrEP offering preventive protection, it might be tempting to relegate these debates to the past. Yet the echoes remain. Many survivors of the 1980s still remember the desperation of being told there was no hope while knowing that alternatives were out there, albeit denied. Many still ask whether history might have been different if medicine had been less entangled with politics and money. The silence of the 1980s was not only the silence of untreated patients dying in hospital wards, it was also the silence imposed on voices who dared to say there might be another way. Breaking that silence now is part of honoring the truth, part of restoring the dignity of those who lived and died through it, and part of ensuring that the mistakes of that era are never repeated.